Welcome to the NAPE YouTube site. Now today I talk with David Reedy about a most important update on a highly regarded book on the teaching of primary English, written by Eve, Bearne and David. David, thank you very much indeed for joining the NAPE YouTube site today. And today we're going to look at an exciting development of the teaching of English in primary schools. And if you can look over my shoulder, you will see the book that we'll be talking about. So without further ado, welcome.
Thank you very much. Just a quick word about that picture. That's the front of the hardback version. The paperback version is a much nicer picture on the front. Kind of a variation on the first edition's picture, but with a lovely blue background rather than a white background.
To start with, could you please tell us about your career, which eventually led you and Eve to write this invaluable book on the teaching of primary English?
Well, I'll start with Eve. Eve can't be with us today to talk about it. Eve spent about 20 years actually teaching in schools and colleges before going on to the Faculty of Education at Cambridge, where after she'd been a project officer for the National Writing Project back in the day. And Eve, then when I met her, probably about 15 years ago now, when we both were active in the UK Literacy Association. And so that's where we met, and we've done a bit of writing since then together. My kind of career trajectory has started as I was a primary school teacher in North London for around 10 years, and then went into advisory work. So I was in the LINK project, if you remember that, the Language in the National Curriculum project, which ran in the 90s. And I stayed in Barking and Dagenham, and eventually was as an advisor for primary English, primary literacy, and then eventually the principal advisor for primary schools, so with responsibility for 50 schools and all the associated Ofsted intricacies that go with it. And then while I was doing that, I was doing a bit of lecturing at various universities and doing a bit of writing, and then became part of UKLA. And with Eve, we started writing things like, I don't know if people know this, so one of the first things we did was we wrote Teaching Grammar Effectively in Primary School. And we did a couple of those. And one of the things, and I still work with schools. I've stopped working for Barking and Dagenham. I did a bit of work as a co-director for the Cambridge Primary Review Trust, and I still work with schools across the country, basically around developing the teaching of reading at the moment, particularly in terms of making meaning from texts. And one of the things that both Eve and Routledge actually approached me to see if I was interested in writing something, a kind of handbook for teaching primary English to go in a series that they were doing back in a few years ago. I mean, there's a teaching primary science, there's a teaching primary mathematics, and this was going to complement and add to that series. And so I asked Eve if we could do it together, and so it's a real true collaboration between Eve and myself. This book represents, and we were really pleased to do it, because actually what I think there were a number of books which tried to do the same thing, still out there, kind of rivals to this one. But what we felt, Eve and I felt, that we needed to do was to put together a text that served a number of purposes, that would act as a handbook for initial teacher education, for students studying to be primary school teachers who were specialising in English/literacy teaching, but also a handbook for English/literacy leads in primary schools. And what we felt wasn't quite there, and what we hoped would be a kind of unique selling point for this one, was that we didn't feel, although some of the other books that were around were very good summaries of the research element, what they weren't doing quite as well was to show how did that play out in classrooms? What was the link between theory, research, and practice? And therefore, what did it look like in a classroom? If you were going to draw on this really interesting theory and research that was going on, how did that then? What did that mean in a reading lesson? How did the research into how children make meaning from text then work in terms of the kinds of questions you might ask, the kind of conversations you might have around a text? So certainly in the first edition and again in the second edition, there's lots of case studies and kind of practical descriptions of classroom practice, which show how the research kind of enacts itself, if you like. And of course, alongside the book, there is a massive web resource with videos, with with audio clips, with video clips, with quizzes, with descriptions of more descriptions than practice, which people who get the book can then access quite easily. So that's kind of where we got to at the minute.
Because really what you're saying is look at the current theory and see how it translates in practical classroom teaching and how that can come about. And you've already mentioned the practical examples through video and audio. So if anybody looks at the first edition, the 2017 edition, there's an extensive list of contents broken up in that way. Was that so that teachers and students could access exactly what they needed to find out easily? Was that the idea behind it?
Well, it was, yeah, that was the idea. And so what you have in the book is you have essentially 4 sections. You've got the kind of the 3-part nature of English literacy. So you've got spoken language, you've got reading, and you've got writing. And of course, they are completely integrated with it. In practice, of course, yeah. Those 3 modes are interrelating all the time. Although when you're writing about it, you kind of separate them out in order to make it more accessible to talk about the different angles in the research. But of course, in the classroom, all 3 of them are kind of play out, if you like, in every single English lesson, in literacy lesson. So you're going to have talk, you're probably going to do some reading, and you're probably going to draw on the reading that you've done to do a bit of writing or more over a more extended period. All 3 elements are going to be integrated into that pedagogical process. But in the book itself, so the first 3 key sections are around spoken language, including the development of spoken language, but spoken language is a pedagogical tool. And so we talk an awful lot in one of the chapters about Robin Alexander's work and dialogic teaching. Then we move into reading, and we grapple with the controversies over the reading wars and the role of phonics. And we say that phonics is essential, but not sufficient, obviously, to become fully rounded readers. And then we move into writing, and again we kind of grapple with some of the more controversial bits of writing to do with grammar, for example, and what's the role of grammar teaching. And then the 4th section is English in the 21st century, and the way that literacy is constantly changing as the tools for making meaning change, and with new technologies and so on. But alongside that, and related to that, is the need for critical literacy. So there's a significant chapter towards the end of the book on critical literacy.
So that sort of leads us quite nicely, and you've sort of mentioned it, to the latest edition, the second edition, and what you've added for the 21st century so far, because quite rightly, it's changing all the time into almost digital literacy, which, looking at the list I've got, makes quite a significant input into the second edition. Is that right?
That's absolutely right, yes. The first three sections to do with spoken language reading and writing, we have updated in the light of new research. There hasn't, for me, been a significant paradigm shift in thinking about those three areas in particular. And so what we did was to look at what new research was out there, updated the things, changed things. So, for example, going back to dialogic teaching, Professor Alexander has published his handbook in 2020. That meant some significant kind of changes to what we'd written there about dialogic teaching. So there's been aspects such as that. There's some new stuff around reading for pleasure, which is integrated in. So we've updated all those. But the significant change has been in the last section around literacy in the 21st century, because the tools for literacy are significantly changing. And what we have with digital literacies and the internet in particular is we have this mass of information suddenly becoming available through different devices which children have access to. And so one of the things that we need to be thinking about is how do we navigate our way, make sense of all this stuff that's coming at us in critical ways, so that we can, we hear a lot about fake news, about information that's not backed up by any kind of verification or whatever it is. So we've got to think about that. And the other thing that we wanted to bump up, and Eve was more responsible for the rewriting of that last section than I was. But one of the things that we bumped up, we wanted to talk about more, was literacy for social justice. So when we're talking about critical literacy, we're not just talking about being critical about the text that we have in front of us and asking questions about veracity and where they've come from and so on. But it's also about how can we help to make the world a better place through the meanings that we make and the interaction we have with information and the literacies that are around us. So we wanted to emphasize that a bit more. And draw on, there's a lot of thinking going on about critical literacy at the moment. There's a lot of thinking going on about the way that the new literacies, if you like, overlay the old ones. It's much more complex now, because children, unlike when I was growing up, and I was 10 years old, there were no computers, there were no mobile phones. So there was one kind of literacy, and we had reading on screen, of course we did. But now there are so many other tools and so many other forms of text that we need to get to grips with, as well as keeping touch with the more traditional kinds of literacy that's out there. So schools have got a very complex task.
Yes, they do. Yes, that's absolutely true.
That's why the book's so long. So the first edition was long enough, but the second edition is probably 50 pages longer. There's probably another 10 to 15,000 words in it. Yeah, it's about 500 pages.
So it's become almost a reference book.
Yeah, but what we've tried to do is to make it a handbook, so that you can refer to it if you're in, if you're a literacy lead in a primary school, and you're thinking about, well, what do I need to think about in terms of the teaching of grammar and punctuation? There's a section in there about grammar.
You dip into it.
And you dip into it. Or We
Yeah.
don't really think about poetry very much in this school. Okay, there's a chapter in there about what the research says about poetry and the teaching of poetry, and some examples of how you might go about doing it. So it's both comprehensive, but it's hopefully also something that you can just dip into as well.
Fantastic. Now, is there anything you wanted to particularly highlight in this new edition, which you're, say, proud of, for instance?
I think well, really like the cover.
I do too, actually. I wish I'd put that behind me, but hey-ho.
I think it's an improvement on the first edition, even though the first edition was very well received. For example, it was awarded the UK Literacy Association Academic Book of the Year back in 2017.
Wow.
And has sold really well. And so we think this second edition is better. It's updated and it's longer. So it's never mind the quality, feel the width, I think is
no, we get quality and width now.
Yeah, quality and width, yes.
Yeah.
And in particular, I think that last section on literacies in the 21st century literacies, I think is really well worth. It's much better than it was in the first edition.
So for those who've got the 2017, it's worth getting the new edition because of the critical literacy section.
Absolutely, yeah.
So sell your old book and get a new one is perhaps the basic message underneath that.
Yeah, if you're in a university, then get the university library to buy a couple of hard copies and e-copies.
Yeah, yes, of course. That's interesting. E-copies, yes. Now, is there anything else you wanted to mention before we come to a close?
No, just to say thank you for inviting me to talk about the book. We're really quite proud of it. I think it's a unique in terms of what's out there at the moment, and so I'm really pleased that I've got a chance to talk about it with you. And I'd also say thank you to Eve, who is a wonderful co-author as well as a brilliant editor. And so this book is, as I said earlier on, it's a true collaboration between the two of us, and it was the most enjoyable experience.
Well, clearly, we're sorry Eve wasn't able to join us today, but please pass on NAPE's thanks to her for allowing this video to be produced. So without further ado, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to put the link below to the publisher's website so you can go straight there. And thank you very much indeed, David. Thank you.